Hello, everyone. I am so honored to be here with you tonight, and I want to give my deepest heartfelt gratitude and thanks to the Theosophical Society of America for giving me this opportunity to talk about a topic that is very dear to my heart: contemporary paganism, Wicca, and witchcraft. So I wanted to start quickly by telling you a little bit more about who I am, because I think it is important for you to have kind of an understanding and a framework to understand how I am approaching this topic. So first, I want to be clear that I do identify as a contemporary pagan, as a witch, and as a Wiccan. And part of what is interesting about these different traditions that we're going to be discussing today is that they are not institutional, they are not proselytizing traditions. And so what is interesting about this is that very few people are actually born into these traditions, and yet, although they are not proselytizing, people do at some point in time choose to identify as a pagan, as a witch, as a Wiccan. So every single person who is coming into one of these traditions has their own kind of unique origin story, and mine is a unique origin story because it is mine, and yet at the same time, it is not particularly unusual. And so I thought that I might start by telling you a little bit about how I found myself in these traditions that we are talking about tonight. So I'm going to talk here a little bit about what I'm calling Gwendolyn's Theoria. So Theoria is an ancient Greek word, and it means sacred journey. And this is how I understand my own life. So the first thing that I wanted to share is that I make absolutely no sense to myself whatsoever without reincarnation, because since I was a very, very young girl, I was completely and totally obsessed with ancient Greece. I always have been. And I have, as part of my experience, what I believe are past life memories that go back a very long way into this ancient set of cultures in ancient Greece. And I also have experiences from being a young child that I have always taken as being experiences of close relationship with various of the Hellenic theoi, the ancient Greek gods. And I have always felt a closeness and a loving relationship with a number of these great beings. So this is one of the through lines that comes through this particular incarnation. And I think it is important for me to emphasize that there is absolutely nothing at all in my family background, the way I was raised, the surrounding culture that I was finding myself in, that would explain any of this. I'm incredibly fortunate to have a deeply loving and accepting and supportive family, but this also makes me weird. And so this is one of the things that frankly is a fairly common experience in many of the people who find themselves in these traditions. It's not everyone, but many people have this in their background. The other thing is that from the time I was young, I have always had a certain number of fairly regular experiences that someone might call psychic or extraordinary spiritual experiences. And I want to emphasize that these are not just at a level of interpretation, they're at a level of perception in which I, at times and fairly regularly, perceive the world differently than is commonly understood in the dominant culture or commonly understood in my family. So again, this is not something that comes out of my particular immediate family in the way in which I was raised. And that these were regular enough that they needed to have some ability to have meaning making associated with them so that I could incorporate them into my sense of the world, into the sense of who and what I am. And I did not find this in the dominant culture, but I had to create my own path through that. So these are two through lines that come throughout this particular incarnation. So honestly, I did not know for a very long time until I was a teenager that there was anyone else like me. I didn't know other people like me. I didn't know anyone else who had these experiences. I didn't talk about them very much because there was no one who seemed to be able to talk to me and with me about them. And so it was not until the mid 80s, in which I was a teenager, that I had a couple of different things happen. And one of them was that at that point in time, Laurie Cabot, who was the Witch of Salem, and she was on a television show around Halloween talking about, this is what witchcraft is, this is what magic is, we are not Satanists, this is what we do. And I saw it and I was like, oh, there is someone else who is like me. I'm not alone in this world. And not long after that, there was a large independent bookstore that was founded in the city in which I lived. And suddenly there on the shelves in a little section off to the side were a whole bunch of authors writing books that were on paganism and Wicca and various other kinds of spiritual topics. And I realized that few different things. There were other people like me. There was knowledge that I could learn, and that the skills and these various experiences that I had could be further developed, that there were communities that I could find and join, and that they were in particular types of places. And so it was in the mid 80s that I began identifying as a witch and as a pagan. Now, I had come into contact with Wicca at that point through the books, but by and large, most of the people who were Wiccan at that point in time, it was lineage based, and you had to be initiated by another Wiccan in order to become a Wiccan. And so I did not take on to myself the identity as a Wiccan at that point yet. But I was extremely excited. I ended up over the next number of years reading everything I could get my hands on, moving to some of the places that had other people who were like me, studying with them, joining community. And it was a really wonderful kind of exploration. And like I said, I found that there were words for people like me. So that is my experience of how I became a witch and a pagan. And it was more a matter of recognition. And often in people's origin stories, that is part of what they talk about. So I think it's important to just kind of recognize a bit. Now, during all of this, especially since we are fortunate to be here today with the Theosophical Society, as I was doing all of this reading, I also came in contact with the works, the great works of Madame Helena Blavatsky and Annie Besant in particular. And they also really helped shape my understanding and my practice at that point. And so that when I moved into Washington, D.C., I found the National Capital Lodge. I was able to join the Theosophical Society, and I can now add the term Theosophist to all of those descriptors that make up my identity. So during this time, I've had a lot of different training and a lot of different traditions and in a lot of different kinds of practices, including shamanic practitioner methods and so forth. And I had initiated into one of the Wiccan traditions a number of years ago now, like quite some time ago now. And then eventually I also found the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, which is an eclectic Wiccan tradition. And I joined the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, and I have now gone through the 3 initiations to become a high priestess of the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel. And I founded a coven that is a small ritual working group and an initiatory group that is in Washington, D.C., and is a part of the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel. And I serve as priestess Apollon, the god Apollon, Apollo, and Athena, and I work primarily with the Hellenic Theoi. So that's a bit about me and my journey that I wanted to share, because again, everyone is unique, but there's still some similarity there. So I want to talk quickly about what is this thing that we are discussing when we say paganism, Wicca, witchcraft. There are a lot of different aspects here that I think are worth discussing. But when I am talking about them, I'm going to talk about contemporary paganism as a movement. So I'm talking about an entire movement, and specifically it is a new religious movement that has its roots in the early and mid 20th century. However, this new religious movement arises out of a soil, out of a foundation that includes a number of absolutely critical, important historical antecedents. And the most important of those is inspiration from ancient cultures. So pagans are taking inspiration from the pre-Christian cultures in several different places. First of all, in the area, the cultural milieu in which Christianity initially arose. So this would be all of those cultures that were part of the Roman Empire. So lots of pieces of Europe. Also, though, the Near East, the Middle East, down into parts of Africa that were part of the Roman Empire, such as Egypt and Carthage. And then as Christianity spreads, contemporary paganism is taking inspiration from many of these other, mostly European traditions, looking at the pre-Christian traditions. I want to emphasize that this is inspiration, and inspiration is both in terms of imaginative and in terms of rebuilding relationships with many of these great ones, many of the old gods. Many people do walk into various experiences like I have, where they have direct contact with what we believe are the old gods of some of these different traditions. But there's also, pagans do a lot of study. We actually read a lot of scholarship. And I think that is another area where what we're doing is we are finding inspiration in the scholarship as well as through these kind of creative, artistic, and intuitive modes. And as I said, there's a lot of differentiation there. So, you have the heathens, for instance, take their inspiration primarily from the ancient Nordic traditions. The Kemetic people may take their inspiration primarily from the Egyptian. So there's a lot of variety, but that inspiration from ancient cultures is very important in terms of trying to bring them through and have them rebirthed into an appropriate type of modern context. And we'll talk some more about that in a minute. But another part of this very fertile ground, the soil from which contemporary paganism grows, are the Western ceremonial magical traditions. And there are quite a number of these. Of course, you have the various Kabbalistic traditions, you have Rosicrucian, Golden Dawn, you have a lot of alchemical and theurgetic traditions, and in particular, a lot of the ways of working, a lot of the ways of doing magic that come from the ceremonial traditions make their way into pagan ritual forms. Additionally, there is folk magic. So folk magic are the various ways in which people do things on this more less formal way of ceremony. And in many cases, there's kind of this thin veneer that you can really figure out how to pull back relatively easily and begin to see some of the pre-Christian influence that is there in the culture that comes out in the ways in which people use magic. So that is another source of inspiration and knowledge that is there that comes into contemporary paganism. There are also inspirations that arise from encounters with some of the non-Western traditions. And there are really two major streams of this. One of them actually is through Theosophy. As I'm sure you all know, Theosophy in the 19th century brings into dialogue the esoteric, so the inner traditions from many of the Eastern traditions, especially some of the Indic traditions, with some of the esoteric traditions in the West. And in doing so, there is an exchange and this kind of conceptual use of a number of pieces of language and overarching kinds of concepts that actually end up then being picked up and carried into contemporary paganism. So contemporary pagans will often rely on a lot of the understanding of things like subtle physiology, like your chakras, and things like karma, and a lot of these big conceptual patterns that actually have their root in Indic traditions in particular, but they also come through kind of the theosophical understanding on their way into contemporary paganism. So I think that is a piece of legacy that I'm very happy to honor in this moment. The other main source of some of these inspirations that come from non-Western traditions includes in particular encounters and explorations to take imaginatively as well as just on this inspirational level, contact with some of the various Aboriginal and First Nations traditions in terms of, again, this kind of spiritual inspiration, not copying practices, but spiritual inspiration, in particular around the ways in which they live nature reverence and appropriate relationships with nature. Because another part that is there in the soil are all of the various ecological movements, that is another piece that is incredibly important for contemporary paganism. And this includes things like the more scientific Gaia hypothesis, as well as some of the older transcendental kinds of traditions that are looking at ways of sacralizing, resacralizing relationships with nature. So all of those are historical antecedents that make up this kind of ground from which contemporary paganism arises. So in addition to many other things, I also wear a hat as an academic researcher in which I do research on contemporary pagans. And one of the things I can tell you from that particular hat is that while pretty much anyone within any of these traditions will recognize each other as being a part of the same kind of broad community, there is not agreement on terminology. So I just need to be upfront. There is not agreement on terminology. I did a very large-scale national survey, and I allowed people to choose however many of the kind of pagan descriptors they wanted to choose for themselves. It's first interesting to note that there is not a single person out of my over 3,000 participants who only chose one. Everyone chose a combination. This is a very kind of both and sort of culture. But the largest group that people used was pagan. That was the most commonly used terms. And that was still only about 65%. So I want to talk to you about how I am using these terms. So I am using pagan as an umbrella term to incorporate all of these different traditions. As I mentioned, the heathens that take their inspiration from the Norse. There are Dianic Wiccans and goddess worshippers who primarily focus on the divine feminine. There are, Celtic Reconstructionists. There are the Kemetic people, which I mentioned before, that do a lot with the Egyptian. There are people who take inspiration from the Hellenic, and then there are full Hellenic Reconstructionists for the Greek. There's just a ton of different variety here. But like I said, they will recognize themselves as being a part of an overarching community. So I put this under that umbrella of pagan, even if that's not the term that everyone would necessarily agree with. Out of all these different traditions, at this historical moment, the largest is Wicca. And Wicca is a initiatory lineage-based tradition, at least in the beginning. So in the beginning, and it has its roots in the 1930s in Britain. And in order to become a Wiccan, you originally had to be initiated by another Wiccan. Now, I need to be clear that at this historical moment, the vast majority of people who are Wiccans have self-initiated. So that is no longer necessarily the case. But there are a number of characteristics that I'm going to go through in more depth in a later part of this talk that unite Wicca as a particular type of tradition. And as I said, at this historical moment, it is the largest. Now, some Wiccans also describe themselves as witches, but not all Wiccans do. Some witches also describe themselves as Wiccans, but not all witches do. One of the key components of being a witch, claiming the identity as a witch, is that witches practice magic. That is absolutely essential because you can, almost all Wiccans, by the way, also practice magic. And most pagans, in this broader sense, they also practice magic. But there are pagans who are primarily devotional and don't really practice magic. And there are Wiccans who primarily are devotional and don't practice magic. But there is no such thing as a witch that doesn't practice magic. That is essential to that particular identity. There is another kind of piece of that identity that is the identity of claiming your identity as a witch that is pretty common. And that is a type of feminist oppositional identity that is saying, I am claiming feminine power and I am opposing the patriarchy. There is also some of that, much in the way in which the LGBTQIA community has powerfully reclaimed the label of queer and made that a very positive thing. That is also part of what is going on in claiming an identity as a witch for many, many women in particular. And so now I want to talk about magic, because magic really is pretty essential in understanding all of these different traditions. Magic is sometimes spelled with a K on the end in order to distinguish it from stage magic, which is all about illusion. But magic in this sense, how I am using it here and how it is appropriately used within the context of these types of tradition, is that these are sets of practices or ways of working that bring about change through the intentional and skilled use of forms of causation that are different than those that you would use or observe in your daily life. So that was kind of dense, so I want to repeat myself. So magic in this sense are sets of practices or ways of working that bring about change through the intentional and skilled use of causation that is different from the type of causation that you would observe or use as part of your daily life. And this concept then is predicated on a magical worldview. And a magical worldview includes a very much expanded notion of the nature of reality, including the subtle and non-physical aspects of the self and the subtle and non-physical aspects of the rest of the cosmos, and the ability to use those subtle and non-physical aspects of the self to interact with the various forms of subtle and non-physical aspects of the rest of reality. And it also requires a very deep understanding of the critical interdependence of all things on all planes. So that is the magical worldview. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. That is underpinning the practice of magic. That is an essential part of most pagan practices. So there are very many ways in which you can approach thinking about this kind of a topic, like what is contemporary paganism as a movement. And I would like to make an argument that one fruitful way of thinking about contemporary paganism as a new religious movement is also as a movement that is attempting to create alternative culture. So there's a number of significant characteristics that I've already mentioned in terms of paganism. All these different traditions, they don't proselytize. They don't proselytize. It is not institutional. There's no institutional authority associated with any of these traditions. There's no dogma. So there's no orthodoxy. There's no sacred text that everyone has to agree to. There's no essential principles that you will get kicked out if you don't have this particular theological perspective. There's a wide range of theological perspectives within any of these traditions, because the emphasis is typically on praxis. It's typically on the ability of people to come together and do work or worship together, even if they are understanding things very differently. There is also an emphasis on the divine feminine as well as the divine masculine. A large portion of this also involves nature reverencing. So these are nature reverencing traditions. There is an embrace of psychism, the ability to develop psychism in terms of using these skills that are considered to be natural to humanity and learning how to use them in appropriate ways, and as forms of perception that can lead to veridical knowledge. So there's also differences of epistemology that are really quite different than, epistemology being how do we know what we know, that are quite different than those accepted in the mainstream cultures. There is an emphasis on the sacredness of embodiment as well. So the embodiment within our own bodies, claiming the sacredness of our own bodies, but also on the divine eminent throughout the world, throughout everything, as well as a focus on the divine transcendence. So there's a number of different things here that are kind of creating an alternative to the dominant culture that I want to go into in a little bit more depth, because there is a strong countercultural history of the craft. The craft is another one of these words that we sometimes use to kind of make this overarching kind of category. So, as I mentioned, contemporary paganism as a new religious movement begins in the early mid 20th century. And there are contemporary pagans within the United States during that time, but it really begins to take off, at least within the United States, within the context of the 1960s counterculture. So in the 1960s counterculture, many people, especially young people, were looking at their society and thinking, wow, there are really some problems here. Maybe we need to start trying to investigate and create a different type of culture for ourselves, which is why it's called the counterculture. And one of the things that they believed, or that they were experimenting with, is that they believed that there was a deficit in spiritual understanding in the dominant culture of their time. And so they began exploring and experimenting with a lot of things that were outside of the main culture in order to try to create these alternatives. And one of them, you know, as we know, there were a lot of different things going on there, but one of the traditions that they started to find, and a lot of people from the counterculture kind of found their way into, were some of the contemporary pagan traditions. And so in all of these cases, there's a lot of mutual influence. So, you know, you have this countercultural movement and people find something in contemporary paganism that speaks to them and allows them for a spiritual expression. So they find their way into the various contemporary pagan traditions. And at the same time, bringing in with them, they strengthen some of the kind of countercultural ethos that is already there in contemporary paganism. Another that is, of course, very important is feminism, second, third wave feminism. A lot of feminists who were looking for a spiritual expression of their feminism found within the contemporary pagan traditions that had a strong emphasis on the divine feminine. They found traditions that could allow them to express their feminism in a spiritual way and live spiritually as feminists. And at the same time, that also then strengthened kind of the feminist impulse that was already there in contemporary paganism. Similarly, with the environmental movement, many environmentalists found their way into contemporary paganism because they were looking for a sacred way to express their relationship with nature and to live as an environmentalist in a spiritual way. And the fact that contemporary paganism already worked with nature spirits, already had some nature reverence, means that they were very open to being influenced further by developments within the environmental movement. Similarly, with the LGBTQIA communities, the liberation movements there for the minority sexualities. Contemporary paganism, because of this focus on divine embodiment and resacralizing our own relationship with our body and trying to resacralize various things like the divine feminine, we're already very open to the idea of minority sexuality. And in addition to that, with some of the emphasis that is frequently there on reincarnation. So there's a number of things that happen there where they found an easy pathway in to paganism. And we have within contemporary paganism, if you look at the statistics, members of sexual minorities and gender minorities are way overrepresented statistically. And that's partially because contemporary paganism is a very welcoming place and allows for these kinds of sacred expression and sacred acknowledgements. I mean, you know, contemporary pagans began doing hand fasting for same-sex couples hand fasting is our marriage ceremony, way before it became legal in this country. So there's already this kind of mutual influence that's there. So I want to give kind of a critique a pagan critique of the dominant culture. So I talk about this in terms of looking at the miasma. Miasma is a word, it's a Greek word, and it means spiritual pollution. And it's the spiritual pollution that comes from being out of right relationship. So spiritual pollution that comes from being out of right relationship with the gods, with the earth, with each other, with all of our aspects of self. Any of this creates this kind of spiritual pollution that causes unwellness. And the reason to kind of frame it this way in this sort of healing type of modality is that the idea is you must cleanse miasma before there can be healing. So as a pagan, looking at this from the way in which pagans tend to look at things, if we are working on trying to create alternative culture, what are some of the miasmas that we see in the dominant culture that we're trying to create alternatives to? So one of the ones that is really significant as part of this is this notion that arises in certain forms, and it's only certain forms, but they're historically very important. Certain forms of the monotheistic traditions, in particular Christianity, when they become wedded to the imperial forces of the Roman Empire and have then this aspect of the ability to have the violence of the state apparatus associated with them. So when you have this proselytizing tradition, and part of what happens in this is that this particular version of Christianity, it's only a particular version, but it's there, that says, if you do not become like us, if you don't become like us, then you are aligned with the devil and are therefore bad. That is a really extreme proposition, especially when you are in the situation where at that point in time, Christianity was beginning to be used by the Roman Empire. So this critique here says, all right, this has also gone into this general kind of problem of if you're not like us, then you're bad. So in general, we see that as kind of a really significant source of miasma that at this point is kind of running through a lot of the dominant culture. Also, we have this propensity in our culture to instrumentalize life and living beings. And what I mean by that is that we focus on what life produces, what it does, as opposed to what it is. So just a really simple example, when we meet each other, one of the first things in our culture that we do is we say, well, what do you do? Well, we don't ask people, what do you love? I mean, there's a lot of different opportunities here. We are more than just our productivity. And so that is also something that we would identify as a source of miasma. We also have a propensity to reduce living beings to attributes, and then we don't actually see them. And what I mean by this is there's a tendency to have so many different categories that you put people into where you're kind of doing the sorting that, we tend to turn people into ciphers, and not just people, but other living beings as well. So trying to reemphasize again, like the divine nature of all life and trying to see them on their own terms. There are also many ways in which we tend to understand power. The dominant modes of understanding power are zero sum. And what I mean by that is this idea that your success hurts me. There are winners and there are losers. Anytime someone is doing well, they're taking from someone who's not doing as well. And that's a construct. That is not natural. That's a construct. And it's taught to us very, very young on things like grading on the curve. If everyone learns something, why shouldn't everyone get an A? I mean, there's no reason why someone's success has to be at the expense of someone else. And so this is something that we take as a very serious critique, trying to look at all the ways in which we think about power in these zero-sum ways of winners and losers, and ask ourselves, is that actually necessary? And most of the time it isn't. It's a construct. There's also this emphasis in the dominant culture on power over things as opposed to power from within. And a lot of our understanding of power is very externalized instead of, again, coming from, this power with, power within framework. So Also, toxic individualism is another part of what we would identify as miasma. And whenever you have toxic individualism, when you have such an extreme focus on the individual that responsibility to community is being almost wiped out, you will also simultaneously have alienation. There is no way that you can have an extremely individualistic society to the point where people are not feeling responsible for their fellows and not have those people feel alienated. And finally, there's a propensity to think in this binary. So when I said pagans have a tendency to be like a both and kind of culture, that really is true. They tend to want to figure out how can we be as many different things as possible and have as many, and so they don't tend to think in these like clear binaries. And so we do have a propensity in the dominant culture to think in kind of binaries. And then there's also a tendency, and it's not just in this culture, it's in other cultures too, to then associate those binaries with kind of masculine, feminine, even things that don't necessarily make a lot of sense. I mean, there is absolutely nothing about sorrow or about crying that is particularly feminine as opposed to masculine. So, or, about the body being feminine and the mind being masculine. I mean, that's another one that is just a really kind of toxic, problematic binary in the opinion of this pagan critique. Because of course, women have minds and men have bodies. So the fact that we tend to do this is kind of this heuristic, and then it gets combined with some of the historical misogyny that causes us to devalue the feminine half. All of that is part of the critique here. So what are some of the relationships then? How does this play into this idea of trying to take inspiration from ancient cultures? Okay, so part of what is going on there is the historical understanding, which I just mentioned a bit ago, is that at a particular historical moment in the development of Christianity, when it became combined with the imperial powers of Rome, and therefore the state apparatus, then the thing to note is that paganism, all these different pagan traditions, they did not just kind of die a natural death. They were forcibly ruptured. So there were decisions that were made that were then enforced using the power of the state to close pagan temples, to forcibly convert people, etc. And this is something that you see in the places in which Christianity first arose in the Roman Republic, and then as various countries came under imperial sway, that also happened elsewhere. And in doing this, because in the form of Christianity that we're kind of talking about, and again, like not all Christianity, there's certainly a lot of different varieties out there, but there are certain types of spiritual experiences that got forced into the ontological basement. Now, what I mean by that, this has to do with a lot of the psychic stuff. In various cultures, as they moved on, it became dangerous to talk about having certain kinds of experiences. So it became dangerous to say, I am perceiving and talking to spirits, because that could be understood as you are talking to demons or something. I mean, it could get you in some really serious, potentially, depending on the time, life-threatening trouble. So people stopped talking about them. When people stop talking about something that is this type of experience for long enough, that's what we mean when it gets forced into the ontological basement, because we don't acknowledge that it exists anymore. If anyone does say anything, they are kind of immediately shut up, and the knowledge about how to deal with these different types of capacities is essentially lost. And so that is another part of the critique here. So the basic critique is one in which this militant version of Christianity being combined with the power of the state is the turning point in our current kind of Western imperial process, that is the turning point. And so the idea is, if that is kind of the major turning point, then what are the parts that were there previously that were suppressed or discarded, and is there value in them? So in no small measure, a large part of what contemporary pagans are doing is going back and doing this kind of archaeological excavation. What are these spiritual parts that were there, that were suppressed or were discarded? And is there value in them now? As well as, what are these relationships that were suppressed or discarded? And can we rebuild them if we find that they are valued? And this means, of course, with some of the various pagan gods. Are there lines of power that were ruptured that maybe should be rebuilt? So all of this is to say that there's these various alternatives that are coming through in terms of trying to understand how we can bring various new inspiration from the past into creating something that is appropriate for now. Because I can tell you, I have no desire whatsoever to be an ancient Greek woman. There are a lot of problems. I certainly have no desire to be an ancient Greek slave woman. So we're not trying to romanticize these traditions, and we're not trying to recreate them. We're trying to see, are there pieces of value that were suppressed or discarded that would make sense to bring forward? So this is a very visionary kind of journey. It's a visionary sort of mission. So part of this then is that we are trying to find the parts of self that we have been unaware of because they have been suppressed. We are also trying to reclaim our power and, reclaim our various forms of relationship, not just with the old gods, but also different forms of relationship, including with things like the ancestors, including with things like nature, including with nature spirits, all of these different things. Can we reclaim these relationships and envision them in new different ways? Can we envision and experiment with alternative ways of being in the world? And this includes thinking about, what might education look like? What might it look like to try to live on the land in a different way? There's a lot of different kinds of experimentation that are going on that. And basically this idea that we should always be on the bleeding edge. We're trying to push forward in terms of development. But I think inherent within all of this, contemporary pagan has the seeds of birthing new soteriological visions for the planet. And in this moment of severe ecological crisis in particular, I think this is very important, and that there may be things that contemporary paganism has to offer the broader community in terms of these different visions of trying to achieve a type of salvation that is different than where we have been before. So part of this, as I mentioned, is this idea of re-enchanting the earth, which really has to do with re-enchanting our relationship and reestablishing a different type of health and healthy relationship with the earth. And when we're talking about this, we're talking about the greater earth. So the earth is more in a kind of pagan perspective than just, the beautiful, wonderful physical planet that we see. That is the body of the planet, and it is absolutely sacred. And we have this understanding of the sacredness of body, ours, the earth, all bodies. But also the idea that it includes all of the intelligences, many of whom may not be physical at all, that are a part of this overarching planetary intelligence in which we live and move and have our being. So this does have, again, this view of reality that sees everything as growing and developing on all levels. So it does have to do with spiritual evolution and this idea of evolving consciousness, that all beings, including the earth itself, are living and growing and have consciousness. And if everything is conscious, we are in relationship with everything. And so this focus on ethics of care and on relationship with all beings, including the non-human with whom we interact, physical and not physical. So I would say that overarching pagan project, if you want to call it that, is that we do embrace the divine immanent and the divine transcendent and are looking at ways to live that way of being. This idea of reconnecting with spirits and broadening our conscious web of relationships. And that includes with trying to find out how do you have a sacred relationship with the trees that are in your immediate environment? What does all of this mean? working with a very, very much more complex understanding of reality than that, which is what we inherited from our dominant culture. And with this broader understanding of the nature, this expanded nature of human beings, is this emphasis on different forms of human development, where we then see ourselves as being visionary co-creators of all reality. That is part of what we are working on with the Pagan Project, and therefore reimagining various types of power so that we are not bound in our thinking or our activities by those that we've inherited, but instead are focused far more on power from within and power with. So now I do want to talk a little bit more and go back to this idea of the magical worldview that sits underneath so many of these different traditions. And in this magical worldview, which will be very familiar actually to Theosophists, is that we believe that there are many, many planes of existence, and the physical is only the most dense. So I always love my favorite definition of a human being from my beloved Theosophical elder, Julia Rogers. Human being is any being in any time and any place in which highest spirit and lowest matter are joined at the plane of mind. So this idea that there's this huge range of vibration and that reality exists on all of these different scales of vibration, and a human being also exists on all these different scales of vibration. This understanding that all things are alive, whether they look alive or not, they do have life. So, something that can look like it's a physical object, it has aspects of it that are also alive on the cellular level and on the molecular level, that there is life there. And that since all things are alive, they also do have mind, and you can in some way connect with them through mind. Now, those minds may not be terribly resemblant to like a human mind, but they are still a form of consciousness that you can connect with. And that everything is in a vast web of interrelationships. This actually gets to a mode of understanding about the very complex nature of reality that is similar in many ways to kind of a Buddhist nature of dependent causation, which many of you are probably familiar with. So we are connected to everything. Causation is very complex, and everything is constantly moving, shifting, and changing. So magic then, as I mentioned before, is when we intentionally utilize those non-physical aspects and power of our nature to affect change. So we're working in those aspects and with types of causation that are different than what we observe and we use in our daily physical life. But one of the things that is essential to understand about the magical worldview that is in contemporary paganism that might be different than certain other types of magical worldviews, such as some of the various traditions within maybe ceremonial magic that, again, makes up some of that ground, is that in contemporary paganism, there's a very strong emphasis on relationships and the health of relationships. So if you've done a lot of study of various magical traditions, there are a number of them that will do things like summon and command spirits. And that is not how contemporary pagans tend to work. We tend to invite and try to work in allyship. So that is part of this difference in some of the ethics at times. So both of those might be kind of magical worldviews, but that is a specific kind of way of interacting that is prominent within contemporary paganism, Wicca, and witchcraft. So I want to give some thanks to one of my very early teachers. I mentioned her in kind of the beginning in my Theoria, Laurie Cabot, the Witch of Salem, because she gave me a framework which I think is very useful, which are some of the ways, 3 different ways of seeing the craft. And I think it is useful because people interact with different pieces in different ways. And as I said, we're talking about non-institutional, non-dogmatic traditions. So there is kind of the craft or paganism or witchcraft or what have you as a science. And this really emphasizes the magical part. This is when you are kind of experimentally doing various things to try to figure out how to create change. And there are people who operate, who are part of these overarching communities, who operate at this level and don't participate in the others. And then, as I said, there are some people who are more devotional who may not actually practice magic. So this is one way of looking at it is, you know, there's the craft as science, the craft as art. And this includes the art of living. This is, you know, a way in which you're interacting with paganism, with magic, with this kind of magical worldview in a way that is emphasizing the creative more so than kind of the scientific. And then there's the craft as religion, in which you are really doing things as part of a devotional practice and as a practice that would be more readily recognizable as religion. And most pagans, Wiccans, have some bit of all three, but may have different emphases in their particular personal practice. So now I do want to talk briefly about what is Wicca. Now, I mentioned earlier that Wicca is at this moment the largest of these various pagan traditions. And I'm going to give a very quick and incredibly incomplete background about the history of Wicca. And this is incredibly incomplete, so this is an introduction. But in the 1930s in the UK, there was a man named Gerald Gardner, and he founded Gardnerian Wicca, which is kind of the first of the British traditional Wiccan traditions. And he worked with some other very important people like Doreen Valiente, was, I believe, one of his early high priestesses. And Gerald Gardner claimed to have been initiated into a tradition that had some sort of unbroken lineage back to the witch hunts. Now, I do not believe personally that there is any strong evidence that there was an unbroken lineage. And I certainly don't believe there's an unbroken lineage that goes all the way back to pre-Christian times. So I think that there's some challenges here. I think that there were people who were doing especially some folk magic practices and various pieces, but I am saying for myself, I have not seen the evidence that there is a complete unbroken lineage. But regardless, I also don't think that that's necessary. So I think a lot of times when people focus on that, they're looking at it from a perspective of trying to assert some legitimacy. And I don't think we need that for legitimacy. I think that if the gods are real, and I believe that the gods are real, then I don't need to demonstrate a clear, unbroken lineage back to ancient times. If reincarnation is real, and I believe reincarnation is real, I don't need to prove that either. I mean, you know, we can have inspirations now. So I'm just giving you that as a bit of history here. But regardless, Gerald Gardner did a very important thing because he really created this tradition of Gardnerian Wicca and established many of the very important ritual patterns that are still very central to Wicca now. And so Gardnerian Wicca is one of the first British traditional Wicca groups. And then you have Alexander's, who was one of his initiates, who had some slight variations and created Alexandrian Wicca. And most of the early Wiccan groups in the United States are Alexandrian. At the same time, contemporaneous with Gerald Gardner was another group, and Robert Cochrane is one of the main ones, who were founding a different tradition. And it feels really different than the British traditional Wicca of Gardner and Sanders. It has a far more chthonic, kind of earthy feel to it. It has less, it's drawing less on some of the ceremonial magical traditions, which Gardner was definitely drawing a lot on those, and more on folk practice. So there's an additional kind of early Wicca that comes out of some of the groups that people like Robert Cochrane were working with. There's also a form of Dianic Wicca. So Dianic Wicca has, in some cases, exclusive, but certainly always an emphasis on the feminine divine. So some of them only worship the goddess. And that makes them kind of a little different. So there's a number of Dianic Wiccan groups, and then there's Eclectic Wicca. And as I mentioned, I am a high priestess of the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, and that is an eclectic group, which means that we draw in from a whole bunch of different traditions. It's including more of the ceremonial magic, more astrology. There's a lot of openness to a lot of different traditions in eclectic Wicca. One of the most important things that has happened in the development of Wicca internationally, as well as in the United States, is this rise of solitaires. So solitaries are people who do not practice necessarily or belong to a coven. As I mentioned, a coven is a small working group, and that is your small ritual group. And then the traditions are kind of like denominations. So the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel is a tradition, so it's a denomination, as is Gardnerian Wicca. And then, for instance, my coven, Theophania, is a small ritual working group that is a part of this larger tradition. But at this moment, the vast majority of Wiccans are solitary practitioners. And what that means is that they don't belong to a coven, although they may get together in various groups, but it's not formalized at all. And similarly, they may be self-initiated, which means that they have gone through a process of their own dedication, and maybe they are working directly with spirits, but they are not getting a lineage-based initiation. So when we're talking about Wicca, there are a number of very common characteristics. First of all, there's a lot of inspiration and things that are taken from the ceremonial magical traditions. Most Wiccans tend to work in a magic circle. And what that means is that instead of having like a dedicated temple or something, they are in the process of casting an energetic circle in which they are then going to create what we call it. It's create, the temple between the worlds. And then they take that down at the end of the ritual. So it's this way of working in which you are working in some subtle space. And as part of that, they tend to work with the elements in particular ways. They open specific gateways, and a lot of this is very strongly influenced by ceremonial magic. There is a shared calendar, a shared sacred calendar. So there are the solar festivals, which are the Sabbats, and those include the solstices, the equinoxes, and then what they call the cross-quarter days. And these are based on the old agricultural festivals, the cross-quarter days are. So those would be Imbolc, February 2nd, Beltane at May 1st, Lunasa or Lammas at August 1st, and Samhain at October 31st, which is Halloween. And there's mythology and ways of practice and traditions that are associated with the wheel of the year, and this idea that we are intentionally moving with the seasons, and that this is an important activity in our nature reverence. In addition to that, there are the Esbats. The Esbats are the lunar holidays, and those are typically on the full and the new moon. So there's this shared calendar and understanding and approaches. Wiccans work with the 4 primary elements and spirit. So fire, air, earth, and water, and then also spirit. And as I mentioned, they use them in magic, and there's invocations of the different elements as part of the basic ritual that goes into the creation of sacred space through the use of a magic circle. But the 4 elements plus spirit are also, they make up the pentacle. And the pentacle, the 5-pointed star, is the most important sacred symbol for Wiccans, and it is used magically as a sigil. And when you're doing various kinds of work, when you're doing invocations of the various elements. There are various understandings of the masculine and feminine divine. But with the exception of some Dianic groups, Wiccans pretty much always work with both divine feminine and divine masculine. Now, this can be understood as goddess and god. It can be understood as the faces of the goddess and god, or the aspects. So maid, mother, crone, youth, father, sage. Or it can be completely polytheistic, in which you are working with particular goddesses, usually the ancient goddesses and ancient gods. And all of those exist in Wicca as a kind of normal part of practice. And like I said, there's some variation on the theology because they are primarily praxis oriented. So you can have people who believe all the goddesses are one goddess and all the gods are one god. And you can have people in the same working group doing the same work together who are hardcore polytheists and believe that they are all different separate beings. So there's a large variety of theological perspectives that live together very harmoniously within Wicca. One of the other absolute key things to understand about Wicca in particular that may be there in some of the other pagan traditions, but is not always there in some of the other traditions, but it is absolutely essential in Wicca, is that Wicca is an initiatory mystery religion. So the ancient mysteries and these mysteries have a fundamental claim, and that is that they are making change. They are creating change through the process of initiation at the immortal level of self. So that when you go through an initiation, if it takes correctly, you will be altered on that immortal level. So it is not just for a single incarnation. And as I said, this is also part of the teachings for all of the ancient mysteries, which is another area that I have a ton of kind of focus on. But this is part of Wicca. And so it is an initiatory religion. And the way in which that works is that you have provoked crisis that is used as a catalyst. It is scaffolded in a mystery religion so that you're provoking a crisis in order to use that crisis as a catalyst. But it is scaffolded in a way to be safer because you have people who have been through initiatory training themselves. And so that is part of what Wicca, especially as a group, is able to do. And then, as I mentioned, for some of the traditions, in order to be considered a Wiccan, you must go through an initiatory rite that is led by a member of the tradition. I hope that this has been a useful introduction for you all. And again, I just want to thank you for being here with me tonight, and thank again the Theosophical Society for giving me this opportunity to share kind of an introductory talk about contemporary paganism, witchcraft, and Wicca. Thank you so much.